Welcome to this predicted paper from Psychology Ninjas. This paper represents the best guess for the upcoming exams. Please use this paper in addition to your other revision. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account. The majority of students from Pine Hollow Primary School all attend the same secondary school and are joined by a smaller group of students from Oak Ridge Primary School. Without knowing them, Pine Hollow students assume that Oak Ridge students are lazy and untrustworthy. They exclude them from group work and social activities, causing the Oak Ridge students to stick together for support, which the Pine Hollow students take as proof they don't fit in. Explain, according to your understanding of social identity theory, the views of the students. 2 marks. The command word explain requires us to give detail and extension to our response. The question identifies a specific theory of prejudice, social identity theory, and so our concepts need to come from there. The 2 marks available are both application marks or AO2 marks, which means that we need to give examples specific to the STEM and the views of the students. We won't get any marks if our answers are generic and could be applied to any STEM. Let's have a look at our answer. The Pine Hollow students have categorised themselves as the in-group and the Oak Ridge students as the out-group, increasing prejudice between the groups. The Pine Hollow students are demonstrating social comparison as they are viewing the Oak Ridge students sticking together as evidence that they don't fit in. We've identified key terminology from social identity theory in the form of in-group and out-group. We've linked this to details with the STEM, with the Pine Hollow and Oak Ridge students, and the fact that they have prejudice between them. We can tick this off in our STEM to show that we're using different parts of our STEM for the 2 different marks. We're then looking at a second concept within social identity theory in terms of social comparison. We've used a different piece of evidence from the STEM, with students sticking together as evidence that they don't fit in, and we've identified that this is the view of the Oak Ridge students. We can also tick this off in our STEM to show that we've used 2 different parts for the 2 application marks available. A researcher decides to interview the students about their behaviour, explain how they could conduct a thematic analysis on the data collected. 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed and thorough account. We also have the idea about how we're going to do this, so we need to put ourselves in the researcher's shoes and explain practically how we're going to go about this. There is some assumed knowledge in this question in terms of conducting a thematic analysis as a qualitative data technique. Our 2 marks are both application marks or AO2 marks, so we need 2 different ways in which we're going to take the process of a thematic analysis and apply it to this particular scenario about prejudice. Let's have a look at our answer. The researcher would assign initial themes to the transcripts in terms of positive or negative views on Pine Hollow or Oak Ridge students. We're showing our knowledge of thematic analysis by saying that we would assign initial themes and that this would be a transcript of the data, a written account of the interview. However, at this point it would be generic and wouldn't get us any marks. So by talking about positive and negative views of the 2 groups of students in the STEM, we're going to get our application mark. So let's identify this in the STEM so that we know we've covered this part and aren't repeating ourselves. And then we would tackle a new part of thematic analysis for our second mark. The researcher would reread the transcript of the interview to ensure that all the important aspects of in-group and out-group views on group work and social activities are covered in the codes given. By understanding that we would reread transcripts in order to cover all the codes necessary shows our understanding of thematic analysis as a specific qualitative data analysis tool. We've gone beyond in-groups and out-groups by ensuring that we've covered group work and social activities as identified in the STEM. We can highlight this in the STEM and we can clearly see we've got 2 different parts of the STEM that we're using for our 2 different application marks. Explain one strength of culture as an explanation of obedience. 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed and thorough account. However, this is focused on a strength, so we need to have an evaluation element in our response. Our evaluation needs to focus on culture specifically and obedience rather than prejudice, so a lot going on with this question. Our 2 marks are broken down further. We get 1 mark for identifying a strength of culture as an explanation, and a 2nd mark for explaining why what we have identified is a strength. Let's have a look at a response. Kilham and Mann found lower levels of obedience in Australia compared to higher levels of obedience in Poland, demonstrating that levels of obedience is an emic based on social factors. We've identified specific research findings as our strength here, quoting Kilham and Mann in terms of their study of Australia and comparing that to other cultures. We've justified why this is a strength because this difference in research findings have shown that obedience levels are an emic, or they're socially constructed and they're different in different countries. Explain 1 weakness of culture as an explanation for obedience, 2 marks. Here we had the command word explain, which means we need to give a thorough and detailed response. This time we're focusing on evaluation and we're focusing on a weakness, particularly of culture as an explanation, and it needs to focus on obedience rather than culture generally. We get 1 mark for identifying a weakness with cultural explanations for obedience. This is our AO1. The 2nd mark is then justifying why what we have identified is actually a weakness for this explanation of obedience. Let's have a look at a response. The role of PDI lacks external reliability, as it does not always correlate with high levels of obedience. Gupta found a low rate of obedience in India at 43%, compared to a high PDI score of 77%. It's worth explaining for this video that PDI is the Power Distance Index and is a measure of obedience and also how accepting of a social hierarchy a particular society is. We don't always have to write things out in full, and certainly with PDI, the exam board would know that that's what you mean, based on your explanation. We've identified a problem with research in that it lacks external reliability, that the results of research is inconsistent, and that PDI doesn't always correlate, isn't always positively correlated with high levels of obedience. We've then gone on to justify that with specific findings from Gupta's research. We could do this the other way round and still get both identification and justification marks. Ruel attends an international school where students are from 30 different countries across the world. He decides to categorise them as individualistic or collectivist. Ruel decides to conduct interviews with students about their attitudes towards different groups of people and their beliefs about how communities should operate. He uses ideological statements that focus on prejudicial views within a given culture or outside of a given culture to prompt conversations with participants. He reviews each interview, giving it an overall prejudice score out of 20, with a higher score showing more prejudice. Describe the risk management that Ruel would have had to have carried out to conduct his study into culture and prejudice, 2 marks. Here we have the command word describe, which means we need to give detail and extension to our response. We need to focus on strategies that we might use to control the risks that might be present in this study. All of this needs to be specific to Ruel's study, as all 2 marks in this question are application marks. Here's our response. Ruel should ensure that ideological statements do not have any foreseen adverse effects on the students in the school, making them feel uncomfortable raising concerns about prejudice in school. We've identified a risk that needs to be controlled in terms of the adverse effects of the ideological statements. We've ensured that we've linked this into the context by not only talking about prejudice, but referring to that this is in a school and the students need to be comfortable raising their concerns. Given that this question is worth 2 marks, we're then going to discuss an additional concern. Ruel should ensure that the interviews are conducted in a safe environment and that he has a plan if students are angry or deeply upset by the ideological statements given about each culture. By having a safe environment and a plan if things go wrong, we're demonstrating that we would manage the risks involved in this study. And finally, by identifying that the students might get upset by the ideological statements about a culture, we're demonstrating once again our understanding of the aim of this particular piece of research. Evaluate the use of questionnaires in social psychology, 8 marks. Here we have the command word evaluate, which is slightly sneaky for Edexcel Psychology because we're asked to do 2 skills within these 8 marks. Our 8 marks are broken down into 2 separate skills. Firstly, we have 4 marks for our knowledge. Our knowledge is of the nature of questionnaires. We also get marks for evaluation, giving strengths and weaknesses about the nature of questionnaires, and that's our other 4 marks. However, we need to make links back to social psychology and the behaviours that we've studied in social psychology, primarily obedience and prejudice. We're going to start with our explanation, or our AO1. This is our features of questionnaires. Questionnaires are written questions used to gather data directly from the participant about their beliefs and values. We're demonstrating clear knowledge of the features of questionnaires in that they're written questions and that these gather information from the participant. They're also sometimes called self-report techniques for this reason, that these contain preset questions and that this is without face-to-face contact, all distinctly different from interviews. We're then going to go into an example of questionnaires that have been used in social psychology. Adorno et al. Used questionnaires to assess personality traits associated with obedience. The F scale had participants rate themselves on different traits associated with an authoritarian personality, such as toughness and destructiveness. We've got a clear example throughout here. We have identified a particular researcher in terms of Adorno et al., but just identifying the F scale would be sufficient. We've gone on to show thorough detailed knowledge of this in that the F scale is assessing an authoritarian personality and which traits construct an authoritarian personality. We're then going to move through and start to evaluate the nature of questionnaires. A strength of using questionnaires to assess personality is that they may be more open about personal and confidential thoughts, about their agreement with items that they would not share in an interview. In being anonymous, participants are more likely to disclose, increasing the validity of the information they share. We've clearly given a strength in terms of accessing personal and confidential information and compared this to a different self-report technique in terms of interviews. By talking about personality, we're making a generic link into what we've discussed above in terms of authoritarian personality. We've clearly said why this is important in terms of increasing validity. We're then going to develop a counter-argument in terms of explaining a problem with questionnaires. However, participants are likely to show social desirability bias as they have an understanding of what responses are socially acceptable. When assessing obedience or prejudice, participants are likely to underestimate or not disclose beliefs that are controversial or may be seen as abnormal by the researcher. We've clearly shown our psychological knowledge by talking about social desirability bias, a particular problem with self-report techniques. We've linked this into social psychology by saying this is a particular problem when assessing obedience or prejudice. We're going to complete our paragraph by giving a judgment about whether we should use questionnaires for social psychology. The use of anonymous questionnaires in social psychology are useful to access beliefs that are less likely to be disclosed in an interview. We've clearly explained our judgment by saying they're useful to access beliefs. We're then going to return to AO1, explaining another feature of questionnaires. Questionnaires use a combination of open and closed questions to access both qualitative and quantitative data. Open questions allow the researcher to access why certain beliefs or views are held, whereas closed questions gather quantitative data about the level of agreement with a viewpoint or the frequency of incidences. We've given a detailed understanding of both open and closed questions, showing the different information that they can access within a questionnaire. We're then going to give another example of how we've used this in social psychology. In our social psychology practical, looking at the role of gender on obedience, we were able to collect quantitative data on the number of detentions a participant had received to access their level of obedience using closed questions. Our open question, asking the participant to describe in detail the last time they broke a rule, enabled us to see how the participant felt about acts of disobedience. We've used our social practical, which has to be a questionnaire, in order to illustrate this point. We've given clear examples of both our closed and our open question, focusing specifically on levels of obedience this time. And then we're going to return once again to evaluation. By collecting both qualitative and quantitative data using questionnaires, researchers can triangulate findings, increasing the validity of their conclusions to demonstrate who an individual obeys and that it is because they are believed to be legitimate authority figures. Once again, we've used our terminology to show a depth of understanding. When we're talking about triangulation, we're saying the same outcomes, the same conclusions from different types of data. Here we've told us what impact that has, and that increases the accuracy of the conclusions that we're reaching. We're then going to give a counter-argument once again. However, if researchers only use closed questions, their understanding of prejudice is limited and is governed by preconceived ideas about why an individual holds these beliefs. Using open questions is also problematic, as interpretation of the data is subjective and would be affected by the views of the researcher about whether the participant is viewing someone as a legitimate authority figure. We've clearly given a problem with closed questions in terms of preconceived ideas. We've linked that into social psychology by talking about our understanding of prejudice being limited. We've then identified that subjectivity of interpretation of open questions is also a problem. We've clearly given an example appropriate to social psychology once again by talking about whether we view someone as a legitimate authority figure may be different for me compared to you. It's time to make a judgment once again about whether we should use questionnaires. The likelihood that participants might only complete closed questions as they are easier might limit the data collected about their levels of obedience or prejudice. Here we're talking about why participants might only do one type of question, even if both types are included in our questionnaire. It's now time to go back to our explanation, outlining another feature of questionnaires. Questionnaires can contain filler questions that include irrelevant information to disguise the main purpose of the survey. Questions can also be included to check the validity of the answers that participants are giving, or a split half method might be used to prevent participants from sharing their answers or changing their mind. A variety of ways to check the accuracy of questionnaires have been given. We've used filler questions, as well as the split half method, in order to show our detailed knowledge to prevent participants from being inaccurate in their responses. Let's link this back into social psychology once again with another example. The locus of control of participants was assessed using a questionnaire to see if they had an internal or external locus of control. Individuals with an internal locus of control are less obedient, as they believe they are responsible for their own behaviour, whereas those with an external locus of control are more obedient, as they believe consequences are the result of luck or fate. Here we've got another example of how a questionnaire has been used, demonstrating a clear understanding of locus of control in terms of both external and internal dimensions being addressed. It's time to evaluate questionnaires once again. The response rates for questionnaires are low and are affected by participant variables, as participants with strong views or more time available being more likely to complete the questionnaire. The sample of participants accessed when using a questionnaire may impact the generalisability of the data and the nature of obedience or prejudicial views held by the population. Low response rates are a critical problem for questionnaires. We've also explained how particular viewpoints might be more likely to be responding to a questionnaire. It's important here once again we've linked this into social psychology, that this may skew our understanding of obedience or prejudice. Given that we've started this paragraph with a weakness, we're going to counter-argue it with a strength. Questionnaires can be easily replicated to increase the representativeness of the sample and distributed to examine trends over time. However, they may contain jargon, such as beliefs about astrology in the F-scale, or be misunderstood by the participant, reducing validity as there is no researcher to seek clarification from. We've developed this with the strength that these are easy to replicate. However, we've gone back on that and talked about a weakness, that they may contain specific terms. Once again, we've talked about specific terms that are present in questionnaires in social psychology. We're going to complete this paragraph with another judgment. Questionnaires may only access superficial information about the levels of obedience and prejudice held by the population. We've clearly understood a limitation of questionnaires and that they're only going to give us the information that participants want to share, being self-report techniques. We're going to complete our essay with some final mini conclusions. Questionnaires have strong internal reliability as written questions to assess prejudice and obedience that replicate the experience for the participants. We're going to complete our essay with some final mini conclusions. Questionnaires have strong internal reliability as they are written questions to assess prejudice and obedience that replicate the experience for the participant, ensuring that the phrasing of the question doesn't impact the information provided. Social expectations and beliefs have an influence on the likelihood that controversial social beliefs will be given by the participant. And finally, questionnaires are reductionist, as questions are often based on the existing understanding of what might influence prejudice or obedience. Mason is conducting a study to examine the capacity of memory. He decides to use a series of 20 pictures, one with faces and one with backgrounds within his study. Mason shows the images to participants for 15 seconds each in a series of slides and repeats this 3 times. The participants then select whether the image appeared in their original slides from a 6-photo array. Identify the fully operationalised independent variable for Mason's study, 1 mark. Here we have the command word identify, which means that we need to state something. This could be done in a simple sentence or a bullet point. This question is focused on the independent variable, or the IV. This is the one that the researcher changes between the conditions. We've also got some assumed knowledge in this question in that it's fully operationalised. This means how was that IV measured, and we need to ensure that we have both the different conditions within our answer in order to operationalise this fully. Here's our response. Pictures of faces and backgrounds. We've clearly got the 2 conditions in terms of faces and backgrounds to show that this is specific to Mason's study and the STEM that we've been given. Identify the fully operationalised dependent variable, or DV, for Mason's study, 1 mark. Here we've got the command word identify, where we need to state something. We could do this for a simple sentence or a bullet point. The focus in this question is the dependent variable, and we have some assumed knowledge here. This is the variable that stays consistent between the 2 conditions or enable us to compare different participants. We need to ensure that we have fully operationalised this. This is where we say exactly how we've measured this or how Mason's measured it in his study. Here's our answer. Recall of original image out of 20. In order to fully operationalise this, we do need to say out of how many items we are recalling. If we don't include this, we don't get our mark. Explain the impact of a situational variable on Mason's study, 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed and thorough explanation or outline of what's happening. This needs to focus on a situational variable. These are ones around the location or the environment. We get 1 mark for explaining a situational variable. This must be relevant for the study and therefore it's an application mark. Our second mark comes from explaining the impact of that on the results of this particular piece of research. Let's have a go at breaking down an answer. The location that Mason used to complete his study on the capacity of memory may have impacted the results. If Mason selected a classroom at a local university, then participants may have paid more attention to the images, increasing their recall. We've clearly identified a situational variable in terms of location. We've linked this into the study because we focused on the aim of the study being about capacity, and we can tick this off within our STEM in order to ensure that we're using a variety of information if required. We've then said the impact of this on results, that if it is at a local university, then they might pay more attention. For good measure, we've also put this in context of the STEM in terms of they're looking at images. However, we wouldn't need to do this given that we've already done application once. The results from Mason's investigation are shown in Table 1. Complete Table 1 and calculate the Wilcoxon t-test for Mason's study, 4 marks. Here we have the command words complete and calculate. What we need to do here is complete this particular table. There is some assumed knowledge in this question in terms of how to do a Wilcoxon t-test. However, there are instructions in the front of your exam paper booklet that will help guide you on how to do this. Our first job is to complete our difference column, where we're looking at the differences between the two scores. So we're going to do 18 minus 3, and that's going to equal 15. We're going to go all the way down doing the same thing. So we're going to do 13 minus 2, which is 11. 9 minus 14, which is negative 5, and it's really important here that we have the different signs. 20 minus 19, which is 1, and so on. Our next column to complete is to rank the differences. In doing this, our first thing is to find out how many different participants we had in our study. So here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And now I would write these out as different possibilities for the ranks along the top. If it's a Wilcoxon and there's a 0, we would delete that score completely, and it's as if that participant does not exist. We're then going to rank the differences from lowest to highest. So we have one difference of 1, so that gets a rank of 1. Our next highest difference is 4, and although this is a negative 4, it would still be given the rank of 4. Our next lowest difference is 4, and even though this is a negative 4, we're going to ignore that bit for this stage, and we're going to give our negative 4 a rank of 2. We can write these in as we go. Our next difference in our train is 5, although this is a negative 5, it would be given the rank of 3. Our next difference is 6, and that's a positive, but again, that doesn't matter. Then we have negative 8, and then we have 2 11s. In order to get the ranks for our difference of 11, we're going to take the mean rank. So we're going to add 5 points. In order to get our rank for our 11s, we're going to take the mean rank. So we're going to add 6 and 7, and then we're going to divide that by 2, which means that it's 6.5. So both of our 11s would have a rank of 6.5. Our next difference is 14, and then we've got 2 15s, one positive and one negative, for our final difference. Again, we're going to do the same thing here in terms of our ranks. We're going to add 9 and 10, divide it by the number of ranks, which is 2, giving these both 9.5s. A real quick check with this is that your highest rank should be similar to the number of participants. These can then all get written into our table. So where we've got a difference of 15, that gets a score of 9, or a rank, sorry, of 9.5. 11 gets a rank of 6.5, and so on. Our next step is to identify the ranks of the positive differences, and we're going to add all of these together. So we would add 9.5, 6.5, 1, 4, 6. And 8. And this would equal 35.5. We're then going to do the same thing for our negative differences. So that's 9.5, and as well as 5 and 3. So we're going to add all of those together. And therefore, our sum of our rank of our negative differences is 19.5. The final stage is to determine T. T is whichever of these two rank values is lower. So here, our T value is 19.5 because that is less than 35.5. Mason used a directional one-tailed hypothesis. The calculated value was 19.5 and the number of participants was 10, with none having no difference between the two conditions. State whether Mason's data was significant at p was less than or equal to 0.05, 1 mark. Here we have the command word state, which means we need to identify or state something. This could be in a short sentence or a bullet point. There is some assumed psychological knowledge in this question, in that we understand what we're doing when we're looking at significance. Here we're looking at comparing our data to our critical values table that will be in the front of our exam booklet. There's some key information that we need to transfer from our question to our exam booklet and to interpret our data. We need to know that we've got a directional hypothesis and the number of participants in our study, which is 10. We're then going to find the critical values table, and for this we're looking at a Wilcoxon t-test as we've already calculated this value. We had a directional hypothesis or a one-tailed test, so we're using this level up here. Also in our question it told us that we were looking at 0.05, which is here. So we're going to be working our way down this column to ensure that we're selecting the right critical value. We then need to be aware of the number of participants we had in our study. We had 10 participants, which means that our critical value is 11. This is the first thing that we put into our answer, that our critical value from our critical values table was 11. We're then going to make a note, again this is at the bottom of our critical values table, of which way round it needs to be significant. For a Wilcoxon, it needs to be less than or equal to be significant. So our calculated value needs to be less than or equal to be significant. We're going to add this to our answer. So 19.5 is more than our critical value, so our results are not significant. We would need all of this information for the 1 mark for this question. Evaluate Tulving's theory of long-term memory, 8 marks. Here we have the command word evaluate, which is sneaky because we need to both explain and evaluate for our 8 marks in this question. We have 4 marks available for our explanation. In this question, what we're looking to explain is Tulving's theory of long-term memory. We have an equal weighting for our evaluation, another 4 marks for our strengths and weaknesses of this particular theory of memory. We're going to start by explaining a concept within Tulving's long-term memory. Episodic memory is the recall of events, such as your 16th birthday party. This means that it is time-stamped, meaning that you remember where and when it happened. As such, you can time travel back to these events and revisit them. Single episodes include several elements interwoven to form a single memory. Episodic memories have an autonoetic consciousness, where we are aware that these are our personal experience, but the recall of details within the event may not be accurate. We've clearly identified a concept within Tulving's theory of long-term memory by identifying a particular type of long-term memory, episodic memory. We've given specific details here, talking about these being about events, that these are time-stamped, and that we can time travel. We've gone even further by discussing their autonoetic consciousness and how this has broken down in terms of our episodic memories. We're then going to move into evaluation. There is empiricism for different types of LTM supporting Tulving's theory. Here we're showing our psychological knowledge by using the term empiricism. This means evidence, so here we're looking for supporting research for Tulving's theory. We're going to explain this with some research evidence. HM was unable to form new episodic memories, as never recognised Corkin, and his semantic memory was also severely affected. However, much of his procedural memory remained intact. We're giving clear findings in terms of different types of long-term memory. The episodic memories were problematic for HM, as were semantic memory. That, however, procedural memory was intact, showing a clear difference between the different types of long-term memory. We're going to elaborate with a counter-argument. However, the use of brain-damaged patients, such as HM, to support the theory fails to account for the unique nature of brain injuries. Furthermore, HM did have cued semantic and episodic memories, suggesting that the nature of each type of long-term memory may be more complex. It's important here that we don't just give a generic problem with case studies. Here we've said why this has an impact on this particular theory, that we aren't going to have an understanding because of the unique nature of brain injury, and a different finding saying that actually HM had similar natures in semantic and episodic memory if they were cued, if they were given prompts. We're going to complete this evaluation paragraph by giving a link or mini judgment. There is external reliability in the findings from research that there are subcomponents within long-term memory. Where we're discussing external reliability, we're talking about the consistency of findings across different studies with different participants. We're going to move back into explanation now. Semantic memories are our knowledge of the world. For example, Paris is the capital of France. It includes our knowledge of things and the meaning of words, making it essential for language. It is not time-stamped, so we don't remember when we learnt facts about Henry VIII's wives, but we do know the information. We've identified our knowledge of semantic memory, giving specific examples. Now, these could be any examples about factual knowledge. We've gone for Paris being the capital of France. It's also important here that we talk about them not being time-stamped, so we're not able to time travel in our semantic memory. We're going to move into evaluation here, and we're going to start to talk about how Tulving's theory has problems. Tulving's theory of long-term memory lacks validity. Here we're saying that this theory lacks accuracy. And we're going to explain this point by saying studies conducted on long-term memory lack mundane realism, as the task set are not realistic. The reliance on word lists to test the differences between episodic and semantic memory overlook other cues that are significant in recall. We're showing our psychological knowledge here by talking about mundane realism. This is the task rather than the location of the study. It's also really important here we've explained why this is significant, and that this reliance on word lists isn't really testing the difference between episodic and semantic memory. We're going to elaborate in this paragraph by giving a further weakness. Moreover, Tulving overlooks that episodic and semantic memories work together and are not unitary stores within long-term memory. The interaction between stores is shown by amnesia patients who knew past experiences had happened but could not re-experience them. Where we're talking about unitary stores, we're saying that episodic and semantic memory aren't discrete and different, that they're working together. We've explored this further by talking about evidence from amnesia patients. We're going to complete this paragraph with a link and a mini judgment. The refinement of Tulving's theory to acknowledge the interaction between stores shows the cumulative nature of psychological knowledge. Here we're using a term within psychology as a science, that knowledge is cumulative, that it builds on past experiences and is refined in order to reflect new research and findings. We're going to go back to explanation once again in order to show developed and thorough knowledge. Procedural memory stores memory on how to do things and is acquired through repetition. When learning skills, our memories start explicit with a conscious awareness of how to do things but become implicit over time. When they become automatic, it enables our attention to be given to other tasks while performing everyday skills. We've shown our understanding of procedural memory by talking about that this is learning skills, how to do things. These start explicit and become implicit over time. The fact that we're discussing their automatic nature, especially when skills are established, means we're showing deep and thorough knowledge of this particular type of long-term memory. In our interwoven approach between our explanation and evaluation, it's now time to go back to evaluation. Tulving's theory of long-term memory is reductionist. Here we've used a key term within psychology talking about reductionism, that this is an oversimplified explanation of memory. We're going to explain this further. Tulving's original theory did not explain procedural memory. HM learnt new motor skills after his brain injury, such as drawing a figure. Here we're making reference to the 1974 theory of long-term memory from Tulving, which we might have our questions specifically about. We've also linked this into key findings from HM and his procedural memory being developed after he had had his brain injury. We're going to elaborate this with a different theory that might be preferable to Tulving's theory. Therefore, reconstructive memory might be a better explanation of memory. It explains why cued memories are retrievable, as memories that are consistent with our existing schema are likely to be associated with different parts of the brain. Whenever we introduce a different theory, it's really important that we say why this theory is better, that this explains cued memories being retrievable. which we've already made reference to when we talked about the cued nature of episodic and semantic memory that wasn't addressed by Tulving's theory. We're going to make a final link here to give another mini judgment. Tulving's theory of long-term memory therefore lacks external validity and the ability to explain how memory operates in the real world. By referencing external validity, we're saying that this is not accurate and doesn't reflect how memory might work in the real world. Given that our command word is evaluate, we need to come to a balanced conclusion at the end. HM's case study provides a research foundation for Tulving's theory of long-term memory. Tulving's theory lacks validity due to the unrealistic design of research and the reliance on word lists as an assessment of memory. And finally, Tulving's theory is reductionist, which makes it easier to test but an incomplete explanation of memory. Identify one aim of the classic study by Raine et al. 1997, brain abnormalities in murderers indicated by positron emission tomography, 1 mark. Here we have the command word identify, which is asking us to state or give a basic or simple sentence about our knowledge. Our 1 mark in this question is an AO1 or a knowledge mark. It's about our specific knowledge for a specific piece of information. The focus of this question is our classic study from biological psychology, Raine et al. There is also some assumed psychological knowledge in that we understand the difference between an aim versus different parts of a procedure. Let's check out our answer. To identify brain impairments in people charged with murder who pled NGRI. We've got key knowledge in here that this is Raine et al. Study rather than anything else, in terms of this being brain impairments of murderers who are not guilty by reason of insanity. Identify one conclusion of the classic study by Raine et al. 1997, brain abnormalities in murderers indicated by positron emission tomography, 1 mark. Here we have the command word identify, which requires us to have a brief but accurate sentence in relation to the question. The focus of this question is our classic study from biological psychology, Raine et al. But there is some assumed psychological knowledge here, and that we understand the difference between a conclusion and other parts of a study in terms of how we would describe them. So really important here that we have conclusions rather than findings or the procedure. Let's break down an answer. NGRIs had an impaired brain function in regions of the brain previously identified with violent behaviour, such as the amygdala. We've clearly identified this in relation to Raine et al. Study with reference to NGRIs, or those found not guilty by reason of insanity. We've got a clear conclusion in terms of the outcome of this study, that regions of the brain previously identified were consistent with the results from Raine et al. 1997. Explain one strength of the role of hormones to explain aggression, 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which is asking us to give a detailed and thorough explanation, so extending our response beyond just giving a single sentence. This question is focused on hormonal explanations, and therefore our evaluation needs to be focused on that. More specifically, we need a strength of hormonal explanations rather than anything else. We get 1 mark for identifying a strength, and it needs to be specific to hormones as an explanation. Our 2nd mark justifies why that thing we've identified is a strength for this explanation of aggression. Let's have a look at a response. There is research support suggesting that high testosterone is correlated with aggression, increasing the validity of hormonal explanations. Dolan et al. Found a positive correlation between testosterone and aggression in UK maximum security hospitals. In order to identify research support as a strength, we need to go beyond just stating that there is research support. Here we've done so by saying that the research support gives the validity to the explanation. We've justified this identification with specific research evidence. Here we've gone for Dolan et al., but you could use lots of other studies to support that there is research behind testosterone linking to aggression. Explain one developmental influence on aggression, 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed description in order to give thorough, detailed psychological knowledge. This question is all about the fundamentals of our understanding. There is some assumed knowledge here in that we understand what developmental influences are. These are anything that changes over the course of our development, how we grow up, and there's a range of things that we could talk about. It's key here that we focus on ones that are appropriate for aggression rather than other human behaviours. Here's an answer. As people develop... And now for our answer. As people develop and get older, they experience puberty, where more hormones are released. In boys, the amount of testosterone dramatically increases, causing boys to act more aggressively. In our response, we've developed puberty as our particular developmental factor, and we've explained why this is different in that more hormones are released. We've gone on to be specific about how this links into aggression, focusing on testosterone increasing for boys during puberty, and therefore being more aggressive. Agatha has recently suffered from a stroke. It has affected her ability to move her left arm and leg, which means that she is going to physical therapy to help her to walk. Using your knowledge of the central nervous system, describe why Agatha's stroke has affected her in this way. 2 marks. Here we have the command word describe. This means we need to be detailed in how we're explaining our particular knowledge. There's some assumed psychological knowledge in this question in terms of the central nervous system. This means the brain and the brainstem. As this is a STEM question, all of our marks need to be linked back to Agatha, so we need to use 2 parts of the STEM for our 2 application marks. Let's explore our response. It is likely that Agatha's motor cortex has been damaged as she is having difficulties with walking. We've identified the role of the motor cortex, but it's more important here that we've talked about her difficulties with walking. We can tick this off in terms of our STEM to show our application skills. We want 2 different parts of the STEM for our 2 marks for application. Let's move on to our second mark. Agatha has had a stroke in the right hemisphere of her brain, as lateralization means that the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, affecting her left arm and leg. We've shown our knowledge of the central nervous system here by talking about lateralization. That our right hemisphere controls the left-hand side of our body and the left hemisphere controls the right-hand side of our body. We've linked this into Agatha's STEM by talking about her left arm and leg having an issue since her stroke, and we can tick this off in our STEM as well. We can clearly see from our STEM that we've done our 2 pieces of application for our 2 marks, as 2 different parts of the STEM have been highlighted. Evaluate the structure of the brain as an explanation of aggression as a human behaviour. 8 marks. Here we have the command word evaluate, which is slightly sneaky for Edexcel Psychology. With all 8 markers, there's an even split of marks, and we get 4 marks for our knowledge and understanding. This is our knowledge and understanding of different regions of the brain. The remaining 4 marks are evaluation marks, strengths and weaknesses of this as an explanation of aggression specifically. We're going to start our response with our explanation. The limbic system is one region of the brain that has been linked to aggression. The limbic system includes the hippocampus, amygdala, and hypothalamus. The identification of the amygdala in fear responses was recognised in the 1930s. Animal studies demonstrate that monkeys with damaged amygdala had a dramatic drop of fearfulness, whilst cats who had their amygdala stimulated went from placid to being prepared to attack. We've clearly shown our knowledge of different regions of the brain, focusing on the limbic system. We've gone a step further and focused here on the amygdala. We've clearly linked this into aggression as specific behaviour, in terms of talking about monkeys and cats. You could use other examples here, still linking to the amygdala. We're then going to move into our evaluation, and we're going to start with S and supporting research. There is empiricism to support the role of the amygdala in aggression. We've shown our psychological knowledge with this point by talking about empiricism, which is just a fancy word for saying evidence. We're then going to explain our point by giving some specific research evidence. Raine et al. 1997 conducted PET scans of NGRI murderers and non-murderer controls, finding that NGRIs had lower glucose metabolism in the left amygdala associated with passivity and higher in the right amygdala associated with aggression. We've shown detail in our knowledge here by giving specific findings about both the left and right hemispheric amygdalas in Raine et al.'s study. In order to develop our logical chains of reasoning, we're then going to give a counter-argument. However, there is some subjectivity in the interpretation, as 10mm slices were taken from the canthomeatal line, which varies significantly between individuals. We've shown detailed knowledge here, with technical terminology about the canthomeatal line, but more importantly we said why this is a problem for this particular study, saying that results are more subjective rather than objective, so they're more down to interpretation. As we have given an argument and counter-argument, we're going to come to a judgment to complete our paragraph. The use of scanning techniques as a body of evidence makes brain structure as an explanation externally reliable. Here we're talking about, again, more terminology, that we're saying that there is consistency in the findings between different pieces of research. And instead of that counter-argument being a problem with Raine's study, we could give more research to strengthen this argument. In order to show an integrated approach, we're going to return again to our explanation. The prefrontal cortex is another brain structure which is associated with aggression. It has a role in controlling emotions and decision-making. It's thought that aggression arises because of a lack of control and damage to the prefrontal cortex. We've identified a region of the brain that is important, the PFC, and we've said why this region of the brain is important when we're talking about aggression. It's time to turn back to evaluation, again making another point to lay out our paragraph. Research into the function of brain structures is correlational. We've identified a specific research method around this area of research in correlations. In order to develop our problem, we now need to explain why correlations are problematic. There is a problem establishing causation, as common physical differences have different effects on different people. Individuals with high right amygdala activity may be aggressive, but it also correlates with anxiety, which is a vastly different human behaviour. We've started off with a generic problem, the fact that we cannot conclude cause and effect with correlations. We've then gone on to say why this is a problem specifically for aggression, that high right amygdala activity has two different behaviours associated with it, aggression and anxiety. We're then going to counter this with some more positive research evidence. However, case study evidence reinforces the role of the PFC. Phineas Gage had damage to his PFC, making him more aggressive following his accident, which wasn't reported beforehand. We've clearly linked our case study evidence back to our region of the brain that we've discussed, and we've talked about what happened with Phineas Gage. To complete our evaluation, we're going to return back to giving a judgment. Extraneous variables need to be considered in explaining the relationship between brain structure and behaviour. We've talked about our key knowledge here, and the problem with correlations is that there may be extraneous variables that explain this relationship that haven't been tested. Here we've made a clear judgment overall about our body of evidence for brain structure. It's time to return once again to knowledge and showing that we understand different brain structures. Dopamine, serotonin and noradrenaline are significant neurotransmitters in emotional responses and are all found in the prefrontal cortex. A damaged PFC results in a person wanting immediate gratification and being more impatient that makes aggression more likely as a response. The prefrontal cortex also inhibits messages from the amygdala. When damaged, fewer messages from the amygdala are filtered and might lead to more negative emotions, including aggression. Again, we focused on how a damaged PFC has different roles within behaviour. We've focused in on immediate gratification, that we're impulsive and we want our rewards straight away. We've also said that there is a role for the PFC in managing the amygdala and how aggression might be the result of problems here. We've looked at supporting evidence and opposing evidence for brain structure, and our final evaluation paragraph is to look at a different theory. Brain structures as an explanation of aggression are reductionist. When using the term reductionism, we're saying that they're oversimplified to explain this complex behaviour. And then we're going to explain why this is a simplification. Although Charles Whitman's post-mortem following his mass killing in Texas found a brain tumour on his amygdala, Charles Whitman was also a Marine sniper beforehand, indicating nurture may also be responsible. We've clearly given two different sides of an argument, showing that there is brain structure and nature ideas here, with tumours growing and affecting brain structure, and also nurture in terms of the responses that Charles Whitman was doing beforehand, before this tumour was available and before he committed this act of killing. And let's come to a final judgment to complete this paragraph. The reliance on case studies of brain damaged patients makes brain structures as an explanation of aggression lack generalisability. So when we're talking about case study research, one of the big problems is population validity or generalisability, that because the sample isn't representative, we can't generalise the findings from these case studies. In order to complete our essay, we're going to give a final balanced conclusion to reflect the command word evaluate. There is high external reliability with a range of research evidence to support the role of brain structure in aggression. There are confounding variables that need investigation to explain one damage to the same region of the brain results in a wide variety of human behaviour. And finally, the focus on brain structure is reductionist and ignores the impact of social factors on aggression, such as upbringing. Mr. Causa decides to set his English class a challenging poem. Farouk is struggling to understand the concept of alliteration. He notices that Eleonora confidently applies the concept, using a silly song to remember what different poetry devices are. Identify one stage of social learning theory that Farouk is showing, 1 mark. Our command word is identify. This is looking for a statement or a single sentence in response to this question. Our focus here is social learning theory, so we're looking at ideas that are part of this particular theory within learning theories. We are only looking for one stage within social learning theory, and this must be linked to Farouk and the STEM and the information that we've been given for our 1 mark. Here's our response. He is paying attention to the silly song that Eleonora is singing. We've clearly identified a stage within social learning theory in terms of attention, but this could be retention, reproduction, or motivation. We've linked this into the STEM and the information we've been given by talking about the silly song, and we can tick that off in our STEM. It's important here we have information from the STEM rather than just name-dropping Eleonora or Farouk. State one finding of Bandura et al.'s 1963 study, film-mediated aggressive role models, 1 mark. This question is asking us to state, so a simple sentence would suffice, although we've got to be aware of a couple of different things that are assumed psychological knowledge. Firstly, we need to focus on a finding, which generally requires numerical information. We at least want to make comparisons between different conditions within the study. Secondly, this question focuses on Bandura's 1963 study, and so it would need to be specific to that study and the conditions within it. Given that they've given us the title of the study, just talking about film-mediated role models wouldn't be sufficient to show our knowledge of this particular variation. Let's break down a response. All 3 experimental groups, live, film and cartoon, displayed increased aggression. We've clearly shown our psychological knowledge of this particular study by listing the different conditions. We've also said that they had increased aggression, showing a clear comparison. We might want to go a little bit further here and compare this to the control group as well, just to absolutely nail on that mark. Rahman's stomach tightened every time the school bell rang for swimming class. One afternoon, it was crowded in the swimming pool and he slipped on the wet floor and fell into the shallow end. Nothing terrible happened as his teacher helped him up right away, but the feeling of losing control stuck in his mind. After that day, the smell of chlorine made his chest feel tight, and seeing pools on TV made his hands sweat. Explain how learning theories might explain the acquisition and maintenance of Rahman's phobia of the swimming pool, 4 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which requires us to give a detailed and extended response. However, we've also got a STEM for this question, which changes how the marks are going to be allocated. As there is a STEM, all 4 marks become AO2 or application marks. This means we need to apply each of our points to different parts of the STEM, and we get no marks for our knowledge generally. We need to ensure that we're focused on learning theories here, but also that we give both the acquisition, so how this started, and the continuation and the maintenance of his phobia. Let's have a look at a response. Raine has associated the swimming pool with the feeling of losing control. The traumatic event of falling into the shallow end has been linked to the smell of chlorine, and now his chest feels tight. We've clearly understood with learning theories that we're talking about an association between two things to explain a phobia. However, because this is an application question, we need this in context. So where we've associated the swimming pool with losing control, this is where we get our mark. We're going to highlight or tick this off in the stem in order to ensure that we use different parts of the stem for the 4 different marks available. We've then identified that this is most likely to be a traumatic event, at least for the initiation or the start of a phobia. And then we've identified the specific traumatic event, falling into the swimming pool, and how this has now been associated with the smell of chlorine and evident in his behaviour. Again, we're going to tick this off in our stem to show that we're using this part of our application. We're then going to move on and look at maintenance and how this might explain Raine's phobia. Raine's teacher may maintain the phobia by asking him how he feels when he enters the swimming pool, giving him attention to positively reinforce his phobia. Again, we've shown knowledge of learning theories and maintenance by using terminology within operant conditioning. It's our example about what the teacher might do in terms of asking him questions as he enters the pool, giving him attention that is where we're getting our marks. We're going to go back up to the stem here and highlight this within our stem in order to show that we've got 3 different parts of the stem for our 3 application marks so far. Let's have a look at that final mark. If Raine's teacher allows him not to participate in the swimming class, then this might negatively reinforce his phobia. Again, we've got knowledge of reinforcement, looking at operant conditioning, but it's not until we put our context in that we're getting our marks. If he's allowed not to participate, we've correctly identified that this is negative reinforcement. We finally link this back into our stem, talking about the swimming class and accessing all of our application marks. A raccoon is placed in an enclosure with a large red button on the wall. Every time the raccoon accidentally presses the button, a piece of fruit rolls out. At first, the raccoon presses the button by chance, but over time, it starts pressing the button on purpose as soon as it enters the enclosure. Explain one strength of using animals to research the learning of the red button. 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give a detailed and extended response. The focus for this question is about using animals within research, and we specifically need a strength of animal research. However, this is made a bit more complicated because we have a STEM question, so our strength needs to be linked into learning the red button and the aim of this particular research. So our first mark is doing quite a lot of work. It's an AO2 mark, which means we need a strength of animal research for this particular scenario. We then get a second mark for justifying why that particular strength is a strength for this scenario. Let's have a look at a response. Using a raccoon, the researcher is able to control more variables in the learning process, increasing internal validity, such as other aspects of the enclosure, enabling cause and effect relationships to be established. We've identified a strength that we're able to control more variables when using animal research. We've given context here by saying that we're using a raccoon in the learning process. And we've also identified that we're looking at their enclosure and controlling that. We've then said why this is a strength, in that it's increasing internal validity, which allows us to establish cause and effect. Internal validity is the accuracy of operationalising and measuring our variables. If you're not sure between the difference between internal and external, you can always leave that bit out but still access the mark. Mr. Causa decides to set his English class a challenging poem. Farouk is struggling to understand the concept of alliteration. He notices that Eleonora confidently applies the concept, using a silly song to remember what different poetry devices are. A psychologist decides to conduct an observation of Mr. Causa's class. Explain how the psychologist can ensure that their observation is scientific, 3 marks. We have the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension in our discussion here. There is also some assumed psychological knowledge here in terms of features of science, and we would need to incorporate these into our response. Because there is a STEM here, we need all of our 3 marks to be application. We need to link this into the psychologist looking at Mr. Cause's class and the specific details within the information that we've been given. Let's have a look at a response. The psychologist could use a directional hypothesis in observing learning in English, as Bandura et al. Have already conducted research into the role of modelling and imitation in learning. Here we have a clear feature of science in terms of hypothesis testing. We've also linked this back into our STEM by talking about this being in the English lesson and an understanding of the previous research in observational learning with Bandura et al. We can tick this off in our STEM in terms of the English class, so we know that we've used different parts of the STEM within our application. We're then going to look at another feature of science. The psychologist should only conduct their observation with Mr. Causa and this class to control prior beliefs of ability being an extraneous variable. We've shown another feature of science here by talking about high levels of control. We've shown control and linked this into the STEM in terms of beliefs about ability, because here we're trying to understand a concept and that might have an impact on our conclusions. For our 3rd mark, we're going to link in a 3rd feature of science. The psychologist could create an observation schedule of expected classroom behaviours to aid replication. We've identified replication as an additional feature of science. We've linked this into the STEM in terms of expected classroom behaviours, and we can tick this off in our STEM as well. Evaluate your chosen contemporary study. There are a couple of different options on this question, but this one is focused on Becker et al. Here we have the command word evaluate, which is a bit sneaky in Edexcel Psychology. Our 8 marks are split into 2 different assessment objectives. The first is AO1. There's 4 marks for this, and this is all about our knowledge of our chosen study. For Becker et al., we're going to need the aim, procedure, findings and conclusions for that study. We're then going to evaluate that study, giving strengths and weaknesses. When we're looking at studies, we tend to want to evaluate using the acronym GRAVE. This enables us to use lots of different terminology and show off our psychological knowledge. We're going to start by explaining our study. Becker et al. Aim to investigate the impact of Western attitudes on teenage girls' eating behaviours. Their sample was taken from Fiji, where Western TV was introduced to the island, with one group of teenagers questioned just after exposure and one group 3 years afterwards. We've clearly identified the aim of this study in terms of attitudes to eating behaviours and focusing on the role of TV. We've also talked about our sample here, that it's all teenage girls from Fiji and the 2 different groups, one just after TV was introduced and the other one a number of years later. We're then going to move into our evaluation. The sample selected by Becker et al. Is ethnocentric, as all the participants have a similar schema of body image. Here we're focusing on generalisability, and that the study is ethnocentric, that all the participants are from the same area. We've clearly developed this by showing the impact of this in that similar schemas for all the girls is likely, as they're all from the same place. We're then going to explain the impact of this in our study. In Fijian culture, there is traditionally a preference for a higher body mass than those portrayed in Western TV. Therefore, the impact of models may not be replicated in other cultures, and the causal effect of dysfunctional eating cannot be established. Furthermore, there are individual differences on whether the media's promotion of impossibly thin women are consistent with our individual schemas about attractive body images. In our explanation, we've explained how Fijian culture is different, that they have different body mass preferences. We've also said that this might have an impact on the results of the study, in that dysfunctional eating habits cannot be causally linked to media portrayals. We've gone on a little bit further and actually talking about individual schemas even within this subpopulation. In order to develop our evaluation, we then want to give a counter-argument. However, with a sample of 63 teenage girls initially and 65 in the second sample, it enables a range of participant variables to be tested and the impact of Western TV role models and norms to be influential in changing the attitudes on eating behaviour. We've tailored our counter-argument to specific details within the study about how many girls were in each condition, both before and after longer exposure to TV. We've said the impact of this in that a range of participant variables or different types of people are being tested. Given that we've developed an argument and counter-argument, our final thing is to form a judgment. The unique nature of the traditional schema in Fijian culture means that the results are not generalisable to other countries who may not have a greater effect. As we've given an argument and a counter-argument, we want to come to a judgment at the end of our paragraph. Here we're going to say that the unique nature of traditional schema in Fijian culture means that the results are not generalisable to other countries where a greater effect might be seen. We're clearly using our knowledge here and giving a complete outcome, saying that the sample's not representative and therefore the results are not generalisable. We're going to go back to our knowledge now and explain the procedure of this study. The E26 questionnaire was used to establish their attitudes towards eating, and a structured interview was used to assess their views on body image. In order to prevent a cultural divide, a translator was used to ensure that difficulties in communication were minimised. Further interviews were given to participants who scored over the E26 threshold. We've given specific and unique details to this study in terms of the fact that the E26 questionnaire was used, that they've used a translator, and that those participants who were severely affected were given further interview. We're going to use this to focus on our next evaluative paragraph. The use of the E26 questionnaire shows strong internal reliability and is consistent in measuring eating attitudes and behaviour. By using our term internal reliability, we're saying that this is consistent for each participant inside the study. We're then going to give a further explanation of this. Rivas et al. Found a correlation of 0.9 for each item, suggesting that the questions asked within the E26 questionnaire were consistent, and therefore suggesting that differences between 1995 and 1998 were due to real changes. We've established a positive correlation here between our items of 0.9. That's very strong. And we've said the impact of this on our results, that actually our conclusions can be about real changes rather than differences in the questionnaire. We're going to stick with reliability to give a counter-argument. However, an independent group's design was used, with different participants being selected in 1995 and 1998. Therefore, there may be inconsistencies in the nature of the sample, such as the amount of TV watched or their pre-existing eating attitudes, that may explain the differences in the results. By identifying that it's an independent group's design, we're saying that there's differences or different people in the two conditions, so not necessarily the same girls were tested in 1995 and 1998. We've been clear about how this might affect reliability and inconsistencies, and we've given some relevant examples for the aims and the nature of this study. To complete our paragraph, we want to give a judgment about reliability. Therefore, Becker et al. Study shows strong reliability by using a standardised questionnaire that could be replicated with both samples. We've gone back to this idea of a standardised procedure and that this improves reliability of the study and enables replication. In order to move on with our essay, we're going back to our explanation once again, and we're going to focus on findings this time. The TV viewing increased over time with a 30% increase in the number of participants who had a TV in their own home. Dysfunctional eating behaviour increased, with 12.7 scoring over 20 on the E26 questionnaire in 1995 and 29.2 in 1998. Becker et al. Concluded that the women in Western TV became role models and their behaviour was imitated by the Fijian girls. We've shown thorough detailed knowledge here with a range of specific examples of findings. We've talked about the increase in TV viewing and the number of people scoring dysfunctional eating behaviour on the E26 questionnaire, You might adjust these and round these figures, and that would be fine to talk about 13% and 30%. We've also given a clear conclusion about the fact that role models were experienced by the TV or the women shown in the TV, and therefore Fijian girls copied this behaviour. We're going to use this to do our next piece of evaluation. Becker et al.'s contemporary study has credibility as the findings can be applied to treatments for eating disorders. We've linked application to credibility, that if we can apply the findings, then the study itself must be credible. We're then going to talk about a specific example of how we could use these findings to reduce the eating behaviours or dysfunction in eating. The impact of role models on body image adds value to having a range of body sizes in TV programmes and adverts, and the body positivity movement in order to learn different attitudes. The conclusions also support the use of counter-conditioning in treating eating disorders. We've given some topical examples here about having a range of body sizes and the body positivity movement. You could use research here instead, and that would be absolutely fine. We're then going to give a counter-argument in order to show a developed logical chain of reasoning. However, eating disorders are complex clinical conditions, and the role of genetics and cognitions have not been acknowledged. Boakye et al. Conducted a case study with SGAs, second-generation antipsychotics, and found significant weight gain and less anxiety at mealtimes with few side effects. In our counter-argument, we've talked about other things that might affect eating disorders other than role models, and it's clear here that we've given a range of examples. You wouldn't have to necessarily be as specific as giving research into drug treatments, but you may have done this as your chosen clinical disorder on paper too. As we've got arguments and counter-arguments, we want to come to a judgment once again. Therefore, the use of social media as a preventative measure in the development of eating disorders and to improve the representation of body types shows external validity of the study. Where we're talking about applications, we can talk about external validity, that the study is applicable outside and to the real world. If it's helping people in the real world, then our understanding must be externally valid. To complete our essay and respond to the command word evaluate, we're going to give a balanced conclusion. The ethnocentric nature of the sample limits the generalisability and the ability to form universal conclusions about the influence of mass media on eating attitudes and body image. The use of well-established questionnaire shows high levels of reliability and the likelihood that Becker et al. Study could be replicated. And finally, applications for social media campaigns to utilise role models to have a positive influence on society show the impact of Becker et al.'s conclusions. Assess whether social psychology has developed over time, 8 marks. Here we have the command word assess, which is requiring us to explain and evaluate. The focus of this issue and debate is development over time, and 4 of our AO1 marks come from explaining development over time and the ways in which psychology may have developed. Our evaluation comes from giving examples within social psychology specifically. We want examples of how psychology has changed and adapted, and also how it has stayed the same for the other 4 marks that we have available for our 8-mark question. We're going to start by explaining one way in which psychology has developed. Psychology does not operate in isolation, but reflects the interests and concerns of society at the time. The social events of World War II and the atrocities of the Holocaust meant that psychologists were keen to explain prejudice and obedience, with many investigating their causes. We've given the fact that the concerns of society is a way in which psychology has developed as a clear explanation. We've then done this by linking it to social psychology, talking about how World War II has prompted an interest in prejudice and obedience. Let's move into our evaluation now. And we're going to focus on some specific examples. Sharif et al. Focused on the role of prejudice to reduce discrimination through the implementation of superordinate goals. We've clearly identified a social psychologist and the role of their research in society. We're going to explain this with details from Sharif et al.'s study. Sharif et al. Found activities that require both groups to work together in order to achieve a goal increased out-group friendships. with 36.4% of rattlers were friends with eagles and 23.2% of eagles were friends with rattlers. However, not all tasks created cohesion between groups, as social context and fixing the water supply did not reduce prejudice. We've shown detailed psychological knowledge with specific numerical findings. You could round these up in order to help you remember them, and that would be perfectly fine. We've gone on to say, well, actually the understanding of this has been difficult in developing society, and the fact that all tasks don't create social cohesion and reduce prejudice is problematic. We've given specific examples from this study in order to show our detailed psychological knowledge. We're going to elaborate on this by giving additional research around a similar time period that was also a response to World War II. During this time period, Milgram explored the causes of obedience and the role of legitimate authority figures in destructive obedience. He conducted a number of studies looking at the impact of situational variables affecting obedience, including rundown office block, that demonstrated that location affected obedience and reduced obedience to 47.5% compared to 65% in Milgram's baseline. We've really shown a detailed understanding of the different dimensions and behaviours in social psychology, this time focusing on Milgram and obedience. Again, we've given specific findings to make comparisons. I've gone from rundown office block because it's one of my favourites, but you could use a different variation if you know it better. We're then going to have a judgment about the link to our issue in debate. Sharif et al. And social psychology reflected a desire to show that world events had been learnt from and changed behaviour. Here we're showing a clear development, that world events had been learnt from, that psychology is moving on our understanding of social events. We're then going to go to a different factor that might show that psychology has developed over time. The scientific process to psychology involves the development of theories and explanations, learning about behaviour with a cumulative body of research that builds on previous knowledge. We've drawn some wider conclusions here, but we're showing here that it has developed and that we're building on knowledge. We've used some terminology within psychology as a science in order to demonstrate a wider understanding of issues and debates. It's then time to evaluate, giving some examples from social psychology. The development of the social approach, focusing on the interaction between groups, focusing on obedience and prejudice, was moving away from basic physical differences, which had come before it, and focused on how different environments affected behaviour. We've been clear here that this is a progression in psychological knowledge, that now we're starting to focus on groups and understand environmental influences for behaviour. We then want to illustrate with some examples. Sharif's research into the effect of competition on prejudice paved the way for an objective examination of group behaviour. Other psychologists, such as Tajfel and Turner, have built on the work of Sharif to explore the complexity of prejudice, in that self-esteem provided by the in-group is a more significant factor for prejudice than competition alone. Here we've shown how the work of later theorists, in terms of Tajfel and Turner and social identity theory, has built on previous understanding. It's really important here we say that why these later theories are better than the earlier ones, and that social identity theory takes into account how self-esteem has an impact on our in-group and why we might experience prejudice even without competition. In order to clearly address the question, we also want to give some counter-arguments of how psychology has stayed the same. However, social psychology has not developed over time, as authoritarian personality is still used to explain obedience and prejudice, despite other factors being explored. Authoritarian personality is still used as there is research support. Elms and Milgram found that obedient participants had higher F-scale scores than those who were not obedient. We've cued the examiner into the fact that we're doing a counter-argument and saying that psychology has not developed, that we're still focusing on early theories such as authoritarian personality. We've gone one step further and said, well, why are we still focusing on these early theories? And we've identified that research support means that we tend to focus on this earlier body of work. We've used Elms and Milgram to illustrate an example of research that supports authoritarian personality, but you could use other research here. It's then important that we give a judgment and an assessment because of our command word assess. The use of historical theories shows that the development of social psychology is limited. We've been definitive in our judgment here, showing there's a limitation on how social psychology specifically has developed. We're then going to return once again to our explanation of another factor in which, or way in which, psychology has developed. Psychology is a relatively new discipline. It has only existed for just over 100 years, and therefore understanding within it has changed and developed over time. Technological advances have been significant in the development of psychological knowledge. We've identified technology as an additional factor in which or reason why psychology has developed. This is more relevant to some other parts of psychology than social psychology, so our point here is going to be that it's more limited for this particular area of psychology. Social psychologists have tended to use older research methods to investigate human behaviour. Again, we're showing our understanding of the debate by talking about older research methods in relation to this particular area of psychology. We then want to explain some particular research methods that have been used in this area. Siddiquis and Jackson used a field experiment, a long-established research method that continues to be used within psychological research. The use of a field experiment allows for high levels of ecological validity, with the naturalistic environment of a zoo used to ensure that strength impacted obedience, with 58% of participants obeying in uniform compared to 35% in t-shirts and shorts. Again, in saying that we're using existing methods, we've said why this is important in terms of ecological validity. We've used some specific examples from social psychology in terms of Siddiquis and Jackson, and we've illustrated our knowledge of this particular study by giving specific findings. This would boost our AO1 marks, showing knowledge about that particular area of research. We're going to continue this by saying other older research methods that social psychology relies on. There is also a reliance on questionnaires to assess personality. Adorno developed the F scale to assess personality, establishing a relationship between harsh critical parents and the development of an authoritarian personality, increasing obedience. Again, we have a focus on an older research method in terms of questionnaires, but we've been clear how this has a link to social psychology in terms of the F scale, and that this has helped us to establish relationships between different factors and variables. We then want to give an assessment or judgment once again. Social psychology shows that psychology has stayed the same and relies on existing research methods that enables insights about human behaviour to be gathered by researchers. We've been definitive in our judgment and linked it back into the debate, saying it hasn't developed, but it has stayed the same instead. And then we want to come to a final conclusion. Social context and topical behaviours have shaped the direction of psychology. The influence of World War II and the Holocaust had a significant impact on Sharif's research into obedience. The continued focus on particular behaviours and research methods shows that psychology has stayed the same. And finally, psychological knowledge is cumulative and builds on the theories and findings of previous work to offer new insights from personality to situational explanations of obedience. A new student named Amina joins the robotics club. She is quiet at first, and some students assume she won't be good at building or coding because of where she's from and how she dresses. During group work, they give her small, unimportant tasks without asking her what she can do. Then the team's robot stops working right before a competition. While everyone argues, Amina calmly points out the wiring error and fixes it. The robot starts moving again, much to the group's surprise. To what extent can social psychology and learning theories explain Amina's experience within the robotics club? 12 marks. Here we have the command word "to what extent," which requires us to come to some judgments about how much these explanations have been effective in explaining this situation. Our explanations within social psychology and learning theories are going to form the AO1 for this particular question. The marks are equally split in this question, which means that there are 4 marks available for our knowledge of both social and learning theories. Given that this is a STEM question, we're also going to have to do some application and apply our knowledge to Amina's experiences. These AO2 marks are also going to be equally weighted. which means the final marks are strengths and weaknesses of social and learning theories. We want to come to judgments throughout about which is better to explain this particular experience of Amina with the Robotics Club. We're going to start with our AO1, identifying a particular explanation that we want to outline. If we're thinking about this, we're going to start with social psychology. Realistic conflict theory suggests that prejudice is based on competition between groups. When there is negative interdependence, where only one group can win, and limited resources, particularly when resources are physical and finite, then prejudice will be higher. We've shown our psychological knowledge of realistic conflict theory with a range of key terms for this particular theory: competition, negative interdependence, limited resources, and the fact that this results in prejudice. We're then going to do our AO2 and apply realistic conflict theory to the STEM. Amina joining the robotic team may create competition over places, as there may only be a certain number of spaces available to students on the team. As only one team is likely to win the competition, this would explain the assumptions about her abilities to build and code. We've linked this to various details within the STEM, that we're talking about Amina joining a robotics team and that this creates competition over places on the team, but also that that team is competing in a competition and it's likely to only have one winner. This creates the assumptions, which is showing the prejudice about her ability to build and code the robot. We're going to identify this within our STEM in order to ensure that we're using a range of information. We're then going to go into our final skill of evaluation. Sharif et al.'s Robbers Cave study supports the role of competition in explaining prejudice. We've clearly identified appropriate research for the explanation that we've discussed. Given that this is a classic study, we can give lots of details about this piece of research. Intergroup competition was created by creating two groups, rattlers and eagles, with different characteristics and social norms. Sporting tournaments created prejudice that was demonstrated by name-calling and negative perceptions of those in the outgroup as sneaky. Sharif et al. Also found low levels of intergroup friendships, with 6.4% of rattlers being friends with eagles and 7.5% of eagles reporting being friends with rattlers. A range of details here shows our thorough and detailed understanding of Sharif's study. The names of the two groups, the different activities that they took part in, and the results of these activities, as well as specific numerical findings. Given that this question is to what extent, we want to finish this with a judgment. Empiricism for the role of competition in prejudice may be a valid explanation for why the group give Amina unimportant tasks. We've clearly identified that research support or empiricism creates validity for the explanation. We've also linked this back into the STEM, saying that this would be a valid or accurate explanation for Amina's experiences of the Robotics Club. We're then going to give another social psychology explanation. Social dominance orientation describes people who are motivated by in-group power and superiority. Individuals with a high level of social dominance orientation view the world as a competitive jungle where people must fight for their share of limited resources. Here we've identified a particular personality type linked to prejudice. We've explained the views of this personality type in terms of having a competitive jungle, as well as their views on limited resources. We're then going to apply this to Amina's experiences. As Amina is quiet at first, the group assume that she's unwilling to fight for resources, reducing their chances of success in the team's robotic competition. The other members of the team might have a higher STO, being more competitive, and when Amina fixes the wiring error, she is showing her ability to contribute to the group. We've got a couple of different ideas from the STEM, that Amina is quiet at first and how this might link into STO. We've also said that by fixing it, she's showing a different side of herself to the group, and those with higher STO as a personality trait may be more inviting to Amina after showing her value to the group. We've come back up to the STEM here to tick this off to ensure that we're using a range of ideas within the STEM. It's time to return again to evaluation. The relationship between personality type and prejudice is supported by research. Coors et al. Found a positive correlation between both STO and right-wing authoritarianism and generalised prejudice. We've identified specific research support here, as well as the findings to show our understanding of this study. We're then going to give a counter-argument to show logical chains of reasoning. Here we're going to talk about cultural factors. However, cultural factors may also influence levels of prejudice. Weatherall found that Polynesian children were more generous in their allocation of outgroup points than their white classmates in a replication of the Bristol Boys study, suggesting that collectivist cultures focus more on cooperation. We've clearly identified a different factor that might be important in talking about prejudice and discussed research findings that suggest this might be the case. It's time to give a judgment once again. Focusing only on personality as a factor in the prejudicial views of the Robotics Club is reductionist and may not explain why they don't ask Amina what she can do. We've used terminology here to show our wider psychological knowledge, focusing on the fact that these are reductionist ideas. And then we've linked this into the STEM to explain what's going on and the information we've been given. It's time to go back to explanation now and look at learning theories. Classical conditioning explains that behaviours are learnt through association. A neutral stimulus produces no response, and an unconditioned stimulus produces a natural reflex. To create a conditioned response, the neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus are paired together over a period of time, until the neutral stimulus produces the response without the unconditioned stimulus. At this point, it becomes the conditioned stimulus producing a conditioned response. We've shown a detailed understanding of the role of classical conditioning and that we learn through association. A range of terminology has been included and accurately described in order to show detail and thorough knowledge of this learning theory. It's time to go back and once again do some application. The Robotics Club members have made an association that people who are quiet and dress like Amina are not good with robots, and so they are surprised when she gets the robot to start moving again. We've clearly connected the two things together. We've talked about an association between people who are quiet and dress a certain way and their actions with robotics. We've clearly demonstrated this further with a new idea about their surprise when she is able to get the robot moving. We can highlight this aspect of the STEM to show breadth of our application. And then we're going to evaluate. Classical conditioning has external reliability, with findings from both animal and human research supporting the role of association in learning. Where we're talking about external reliability, we're saying there's consistent findings. And then it's time to talk about some specific research in order to explain this evaluation point. Pavlov found that dogs could learn to salivate, a natural response to the unfamiliar sound of the bell. Watson and Raine found that fear could be conditioned through association. Little Albert learnt to have a phobia of white fluffy objects through the systematic pairing of a rat with a loud noise. Here we've got research finding from animal research and human research in order to illustrate our ideas. To complete this paragraph, we're going to make a judgment once again. Classical conditioning has tended to focus on the associative learning of individuals rather than groups like the Robotics Club. Here we're making a tentative conclusion that classical conditioning may not be quite as effective in explaining Amina's experiences. Let's return once again to our explanation. We're focusing again on learning theories. Operant conditioning is learning through reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is when a reward is added to encourage behaviour, whereas negative reinforcement is when an unpleasant feeling is removed by the behaviour. Behaviours are also changed by punishment, with positive punishment adding something to stop a behaviour, and negative punishment something being taken away to prevent the behaviour. We've clearly understood the nature of operant conditioning, talking about a range of terminology, both in terms of reinforcement and in terms of punishment. This shows a clear and in-depth understanding. And then we're going to apply operant conditioning to our scenario. Amina, fixing the robot, would give the group positive reinforcement that she is good at robotics and that they should change their views about her ability to build and code. We've said how a different conclusion could be drawn and that this might help them change their understanding and their prejudices about her abilities. Again, we're going to highlight this in our STEM to show that we're using various different applications. Now let's evaluate. Research supports that learning is created by reinforcement in both humans and animals, with animals sleeping less having... Let's evaluate once again. Research supports that learning is created by reinforcement in both humans and animals. We've made a point here about our evidence base for operant conditioning. Skinner encouraged rats to pull a lever by presenting them with a food pellet each time the lever was pulled. Latham and Dossett found that variable ratio pay encouraged beaver trappers to catch more beavers. We've clearly identified research and given the findings of that research. Time to give a judgment once again. Operant conditioning has tended to focus on how reinforcement affects the learning of individuals rather than groups, and so not all members of the robotics club may treat Amina as one of them. Again, we focused on the fact that this is individual learning and why this might be a problem for this particular scenario, in that we're talking about a group of people having prejudicial views rather than just one. In order to complete our essay, we're going to come to some final conclusions showing clear judgments throughout. Research for the role of social explanations and learning theories increases the validity of their role in explaining Amina's experience with being excluded in the robotics club. The focus on prejudicial behaviours in social psychology would make these preferable to explain why Amina was only given small and unimportant tasks. As operant and classical conditioning do not focus on group behaviours, they are less valid explanations of prejudice. And finally, the external reliability with both human and animals being tested in conditioning suggests that these processes of learning are universal, and therefore are more likely to explain all members of the robotics team who may not have all had the same personality traits. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account.